In this video essay, we analyze cross-cultural and evolutionary aspects of neurodevelopmental disorders. The DSM-4 and 5 characterize neurodevelopmental disorders as disorders that are diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. In recent years, these conditions have undergone vast changes in diagnostic criteria, specifically attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactive disorder. These NDDs have high comorbidity, which makes it hard for meta-analyses to be made because you cannot study the prevalence of these disorders in isolation. Moreover, direct evaluation of NDDs varies from country to country, meaning the criteria changes in respect to detection and diagnosis made by different cultures. Despite this, we aim to explore these disorders and explore the subject in great detail, and potentially offer some insight into treatment and what the future looks like for the pathology of NDDs. This video will highlight the diagnostic classifications of specifically ADHD, as well as examining the cultural and evolutionary influences found in ADHD. From a modern perspective, NDDs like ADD and ADHD are disadvantageous, or so to speak. Traits associated with these disorders are less desirable in educational, social, and work environments. In 1993, Tom Hartman was first to suggest that ADHD was evolutionarily adaptive. Quote, ADHD could have once been useful for ancient hunters. However, the advent of agriculture around 8,000 years ago reduced the selection pressure on the ADHD phenotype. Studies similar to Hartman's proposed that traits associated with ADHD, such as hyperactivity, impulsivity, and risk-taking, would have been beneficial for hunters or for warfare. These hypotheses appear to be consistent with anthropological and evolutionary theory. However, it is not yet known if ADHD and similar conditions should be evaluated with a categorical diagnosis or exist as a dimensional phenotype. All humans can be easily distractible, impulsive, or hyperactive, yet every human isn't said to have ADHD. One theory is that there may be a certain environmental threshold in early development, to which if that threshold is reached, it increases expression of the ADHD phenotype in a subset of a population. So evolutionarily, neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD were potentially advantageous in early societies, where it was necessary in the environment to express these neurodivergent behaviors. However, this advantage is likely lost in contemporary weird societies. When looking at the US, quote, prevalence rates in the USA total 4.5 million children from ages 3 to 17, 7.4% of the total child and adolescent population in the USA, end quote. Additionally, current prevalence, according to the CDC in 2024, is 11.4% of US children between ages 3 to 17. This prevalence is ever increasing, but this does not necessarily mean that these behaviors are sufficient for modern environments. Quote, if a child presents behavioral challenges in school, he or she is often quickly labeled, referred, excluded, or marginalized from his or her schooling experience. Early intervention programs often create a deterministic view and provide the teacher with little room for consideration of developmental flexibility. Children who exhibit these behaviors are said to be a major concern for US educators, yet there is no change in prevalence. This factor contributes to there being a genetic predisposition to these behaviors. Despite the social mismatch, ADHD does not follow the traditional definition for the aptly named mismatch hypothesis from an evolutionary perspective. A study involving the genetic database of half of Iceland revealed that, quote, polygenic risk scores for ADHD is associated with having more children and a younger age at first child in both sexes. This study essentially shows that ADHD, while incompatible educationally and socially with weird standards, is not under negative selection pressure. In layman's terms, it seems like ADHD is still beneficial evolutionarily, but more detrimental from a standard of living perspective. Clearly, there must be some environmental aspect in the diagnosis of children, and so it's important to consider other countries' perceptions of these behaviors. Cross-cultural analysis of ADHD is crucial to understanding how these disorders are characterized in different contexts and environments. Traditional diagnosis requires a multitude of symptoms to be present and observed by others. Naturally, this can lead to discrepancies in prevalence as different cultures view symptoms differently. Some argue that classifications of ADHD and its subtypes are culturally constructed, meaning that what is considered normal, disordered, abnormal, typical, or atypical is variable depending on culture. The problem with this is that most studies primarily focus on the DSM-4 criteria. However, it's questioned whether or not these checklist-based strategies are adequate for all age ranges and populations. Quote, Hagelstein, Conyers, Burns, and Smith in 1998 determined that 4% of students reported enough symptoms to meet the DSM-4 cutoff. They argue that the DSM-4 threshold is too high for adults and proposed using a cutoff of 4 instead of 6 symptoms. End quote. The study continues, quote, The modified threshold resulted in a rate of 11%. Using the College ADHD Response Evaluation, or CARE, McKee 2008 found a rate of 7.48% in first-year students at a small private college in the US. Using Hagelstein's et al.'s 1998 modified criteria, increased the rate to 14%, end quote. Even with the modified criteria that lowers the threshold for symptoms, it likely does not provide accurate prevalence rates across cultures. What we see more often in studies on prevalence is that they are the same across the world. Quote, reports of total ADHD symptoms were similar across groups, consistent with expectations. Japanese and US students did not differ significantly in their self-reported hyperactive impulsive symptoms, end quote. Exhibited symptoms rely largely on self-reported interpretation by others. Even then, there's variability in the severity of these behaviors. What we see across cultures is that it is almost impossible to conduct any study of diagnosis like these, as there's a large amount of variables that contribute to the classification of such disorders. There are very few studies that overcome these limitations, and most of the results are either not conclusive or statistically significant enough to decisively say that there is a difference in prevalence or subtype related to geographical location. The conclusion that we come to is that methodologies or diagnostic criteria vary more so than prevalence cross-culturally. What is more plausible is that ADHD and similar conditions are part of the extreme variation you see in all humans, and certain environmental factors contribute to the expression of certain behaviors. Traditional pathology of ADHD has not yet reached the point where it can be truly confined to certain definitions or behaviors. There also isn't enough empirical data to definitively say that it is characterized by one thing or the other. Of course, the DSM-5 and other diagnostic tools are constantly changing in accordance with current knowledge and evidence. However, there still exists a problem of treatment. Of course, medication is one solution to this problem, but it can be expensive and can take months to find the one that works for you. This, along with the increasing diagnoses we see, currently means that medical institutions benefit heavily from it, not to mention the question of ethicality in giving stimulants to patients that may or may not need them, based on someone's opinion. This isn't to take away from people's life experience, however. Whether or not a person has these behaviors or symptoms, it can still be hard to live a normal life if someone has diagnosed you with ADHD. There is a bit of stigma when it comes to these neurological conditions, but what's important is that everyone's experiences are valuable. The next steps we should take should be in the direction of understanding what contributes to these conditions and how we treat them.